Welcome back, and thanks for joining us today. In our last episode, we left off with the end of James Monroe's presidency and what amounted to be the end of the era of good feelings. And we turn now to Andrew Jackson, part 1 of 3. And we now turn to then the mid to late 1820s as we see a return to the two-party system as differing political ideologies are once again forming. However, with the formation of those political ideologies, we also see several democratic trends take hold in the United States during the early 1800s. Now, whereas previously, as you can see from the maps here, that it kind of rested upon property qualifications, for the most part, for people to be able to vote. And that still was limited, in the most part, to white males who owned property. Now, the thinking and justification kind of came down to the fact that really only people who had a kind of a stake in society should have a say in how society is run. And people tended to think that that was people who owned land. But as we move through the 1800s here, we see democratic trends taking hold, as I said, in the fact that more people are allowed to vote. And as they're allowed to vote, they participate in politics at a more frequent level. And you can see that taxpayer qualifications and even universal male suffrage, white male suffrage, takes hold. Now, with that said, you can obviously tell that there's still a great deal of the population that can't vote. Obviously, women and minorities. And it's going to take years upon years of struggle to try and finally win and get guaranteed that right to vote. But as I mentioned, as you can see, as more people have the right to vote, more people actually partake in the political process and get involved. And we'll take a look at some other ways here in a little bit. But you can see it, starting, in the 1840s, when you're starting to get nearly, 80% of the people turning out that are qualified to vote to actually do so. That's very high percentage, very remarkable. Sometimes, in our elections these days, we're lucky to get 50, 55% of the voter turnout. So you can see people were quite active during this era. In fact, it was kind of like a social leveling as more people had the rights. If you're a poor farmer or a worker and you have the same right and your vote counts just the same as the wealthiest man in town, you kind of had this feeling of equality and social leveling. There's kind of a decline in the spirit of deference, as we kind of say. This more of like, I'm just as good as my neighbor and the doctor or the lawyer down the street. So kind of really changed people's psyche really during this era. So why, you might ask, was there greater voter turnout? Well, part of it comes down to the fact that we have the return to the two-party system. There's competing views at how government should be ran. Should the president have more powers? Should Congress? Should the federal government? Should the states? But also, with the increase in white male suffrage, we also see other reasons. There was more elected positions. There were more judges, the executive and legislative positions. We had to elect presidential electors. The rise of third parties on sometimes regional issues. Maybe it's kind of an anti-slavery issue or an anti-immigrant issue or kind of attacking the national bank, something that sparked a rise of a third party. But you also see the rise of popular campaigning where candidates will have parades and rallies and floats and barbecues to try to drum up support and interest and get people excited. It almost became a form of entertainment, really. And then people were, more apt to become involved. Like they had a vested interest in what was going on. But obviously here you can kind of see how the political system kind of evolved, our two-party system, from having the Democrat-Republicans that had dominated the era of good feeling, eventually become kind of the National Republicans, eventually the Whigs during Andrew Jackson's presidency, and eventually turns into the Republican Party in the 1850s. Kind of what we think like Lincoln in the 1860 election. But you also have the Democratic Party which will eventually be established by Andrew Jackson, and we kind of get the nickname Jacksonian democracy, something we'll take a look at in a future lesson. But as those political parties form, they really form to try to, as kind of engagement for a contest for the presidency. That was kind of like the ultimate prize, and that, these political parties will set their, eyes upon, and that's what they competed for then. Now, we left off our last lesson on the corrupt bargain, the 1824 election, and just briefly, as you kind of remember, help you kind of recall some of that, that was a time where John Quincy Adams is running for the presidency. You've got Henry Clay, and then you've got Andrew Jackson also running, along with a couple others. But those were the three major candidates, because as it turns out, if you remember, as you can see, Jackson had a plurality of the electoral and popular vote, which means that he had more than anybody else. The problem was he didn't have a majority, more than half of the electoral votes. And therefore it got turned over to the House. And that's where, the kind of the corrupt bargain was struck. And so the corrupt bargain was, as Jackson and his supporters thought, was that when the election was turned over to the House, if you compare the two maps, you'll notice that the orange states that supported Clay in the election of 1824, Ohio, Kentucky, and Missouri, especially, being that Clay was from Kentucky and was the great compromiser, once things get turned over to the House, he eventually gives his support and kind of encourages members of the House to give the election to John Quincy Adams. And with that, Adams eventually makes Clay his Secretary of State, which was really kind of a stepping stone to the presidency. And because of that, Jackson thought, well, he should have won because he had more popular votes and electoral votes, but they had struck a deal to keep him from taking the presidency, something that he won't forget come the election of 1828. So even though Jackson's greatest claim to fame was being a military hero, both against the Seminoles in Florida, but more specifically in the Battle of New Orleans during the War of 1812, he had entered politics since then and served in the U.S. House and Senate. And so he was quite distraught when he didn't win and actually thought he was cheated from winning the presidency. And so Jackson will now set his sights upon the election of 1828 to try to get even.